Good morning. This is the BLAINESWORLD webcast that can be found each week on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. You can also find us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You get more information about previous shows and upcoming shows at our website, which is behind me, blainesworld.net. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and I'm here in my Zoom studio in lovely Fairview, North Carolina. Each week, we focus on positive news and information about people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce actually a neighbor we just found out, Raven Sterling, owner of Raven Invasive Plant Management, for being my guest today. Raven, you can wave to all your fans and friends who are watching this.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. Thank you, Blaine.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure, and especially since I found out you're a neighbor just down the road. Raven Sterling began pulling English ivy for homeowners as a side job 6 years ago out of love of trees and native plants in the Blue Ridge subrange of the Appalachian Mountains. She understood the diversity and significance of the ecology of the area and created a business by eradicating invasive plants after recognizing the threats they pose. Raven Invasive Plant Management is now a thriving small business sought throughout North Carolina and beyond for mindful management of invasive plants without the use of chemicals. A component of healthy soil, trees, native plants, and biodiversity, Raven has educated private landowners, businesses, community organizations, and HOAs on soil health, the benefits of native plants, and the threats of invasives. The question I always ask Raven, first time I meet somebody, is as a child, you grew up where?
I grew up in Middle Georgia.
Okay. And when you were growing up in Georgia, did you always know you wanted to be this person who's going to be this plant guru?
I had no idea, Blaine, that I would end up being this person. In fact, I started this business 6 years ago, and at the time, I was working on a health coaching program for men in the second half of life. I was basically reimagining myself and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I was really passionate about health and about plants and all those things. And so I was putting this program together, but I moved into the neighborhood of Kenilworth in Asheville. And it's a beautiful treed neighborhood, actually one of the most treed neighborhoods in the city of Asheville. And as I would drive around the neighborhood, I felt a lot of stress and sadness about the plant English ivy. English ivy was climbing all the trees. You would see these big vines, and I had a lot of concern about it. And I was lamenting that. And a friend said, well, why don't you do something about it? So at that time, I put a post on the neighborhood website next door, and it actually became the most commented on post for about a month on Nextdoor. And I was just trying to educate people to the fact that this plant is very harmful for trees, it's harmful for the environment. And that's basically how this started as a side job. And after a few months of seeing the response to it, how many people needed help with English ivy, the business was born, and it really just went from there.
Now, as a child, were you into plants and taking care of them?
Yes, well, I grew up in a part of Georgia that I often refer to as a pine tree farm. So in this part of Georgia, there are many, many acres of land where pine trees are grown for paper products and other products. And we actually have a paper mill in my hometown. I had a stretch of woods behind our childhood home that had a lot of trees and mossy area. I would often find solace, from the craziness of my childhood and my life in those woods. So I started to love trees and plants very early. I also had a grandmother who loved flowers. So she had a beautiful flower beds all over the property. And also she and my grandfather were children of the Great Depression. So food security was very important to them. They always had a garden, they had a greenhouse. So I grew up, with plants and fresh food. So I think at a very early age, I began to have an appreciation for plants. But when I moved to the Appalachian Mountains and to this part of North Carolina specifically, and went into what I'll call the woods, here it's actually a forest. What we had back in middle Georgia were just the woods because they were not really biologically diverse. So when I first went into the forest here in the Appalachian Mountains, I was absolutely blown away by the plants that I saw, the trees, the middle story that is like the shrub layer and forest, and then the understory with native perennials and all these amazing herbs. I'd never seen anything like it. So I really felt like I was home, and I quickly had an appreciation for the area, and I felt like over time that I was actually brought here to protect it. So I feel like that's how I got into this
That's
job.
interesting. So you mentioned though, I love that side job you had pulling ivy. So, and this is a naive question on my part, but how do you know that ivy is not something that you want? It's it grows, and
Yeah.
should you just let plants grow whenever they want and wherever they want?
That's a good question. So I feel like my powers of observation are pretty strong. And I spent some time, actually lived in Atlanta for about 6 years. And there is a landscaper in Atlanta who actually started putting signs around the city of Atlanta, talking about English ivy. And they just said, English ivy kills trees. And so I would drive through the neighborhoods and see these vines of English ivy, growing up into the trees. And I would see the signs. And I feel like that was my first awareness of English ivy being a problem plant. And honestly, when I moved to this part of North Carolina, I'm not sure that I had ever heard the term native plants. I'm not sure that I had the knowledge or understanding of what native plants are and why they're important. But what I did begin to see is that, well, I saw it in Atlanta, and certainly in the neighborhood of Kenilworth. When you see the English ivy covering the ground, which is often why people will purchase this plant because they're like, wow, it's a beautiful
I was about to say
ground cover.
that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful ground cover. But what you see here in the Appalachian Mountains, because we live in a temperate rainforest, and what that means is that we get a great deal of rain, but we also get the seasons, right? So we get a lot of sunlight, we get the seasons. So plants from other areas grow really well here. In fact, we have one of the most biologically diverse areas of the world. So it was simply through the observation and then also seeing these signs in Atlanta that I began to think, okay, this can't be good for trees, because you've got these big vines growing up the trees, and then this vine is covering the ground. So that was it, sheer observation and seeing those signs.
So how do you know if you have vines growing on your tree? How do you know it's bad versus good? And that's a
Yeah,
naive question on my part, but I
sure.
honestly don't know the answer.
Yeah. So in some cases, depending on the plant, you can actually, again, observe the habit of the plant and figure out that it's not helpful for the tree. So we have some native vines. For instance, there is an American honeysuckle, which is so actually American wisteria. Okay. And then we also have a native honeysuckle, which is a coral honeysuckle. These plants are not nearly as aggressive. So what you don't see with our American wisteria is you don't see that plant growing really, really big, wrapping around the trees and girdling them. So when vines wrap around a tree very tightly, and there are many of the vines that we deal with that do that, like Oriental bittersweet, the Chinese or Chinese wisteria, and then the honeysuckle would be Chinese or Japanese honeysuckle. You will see those vines wrap very tightly around the tree, much like a constrictor, like a snake, right? So when the trees grow and those vines get bigger and bigger, and I'm not exaggerating, like kudzu does this as well. these vines over decades will get this big. And as the tree grows and that vine grows and it's constricting the tree, it can actually break through the cambium layer of the tree, which is how the tree moves nutrients and water through the vascular system of the plant. So when it does that, it will actually, it's called girdling. It girdles the tree and the tree will die because it can't move nutrients. So you can often see that the tree doesn't look healthy. Another example is there is a plant, porcelain berry, which looks very similar to our native grapevines. And it will actually grow up and then top the trees. So what this vine is trying to do is actually cover the trees, much like kudzu also does, right? You'll see acres and acres and acres where the kudzu is growing up and over the trees. And when that happens, one of the first things we all learned in science, right, is that plants have to photosynthesize. That's how they get energy, right? So it's this interaction between plants and the sun, and that's how they get energy. So when you have plants that are topping trees, the trees can't photosynthesize. So anything underneath those vines when they're topping them is going to die. So a lot of it is observation.
How long does it take for a tree to die then?
It really depends on a lot of factors. So when you have a vine like porcelain berry that will go dormant in the winter, the same happens with kudzu. If you're driving around right now, you won't see the leaves on the kudzu, right? Because the plant is dormant. However, the kudzu with its wall of vines, right, that goes up and over, those plants are really never in a situation that they can photosynthesize. The porcelain berry, however, if it's not as intense a situation as acres and acres of kudzu, then the trees can do some photosynthesis, but it really depends on the tree. It depends on how much coverage, how much the vines are covering them. There are just so many factors.
Now,
Every tree is different. Every plant is different. But the point is plants have to photosynthesize.
when you put the trees in, then is there something and I'll ask you the question that can be done if I'm the one planting trees and loving trees? Is there something I should be doing at that point in time rather than waiting for these vines to come in?
Well, it's really important for all of us as landowners, if we
Right.
are landowners or even renters or people who just care about the land, that we monitor our land. I always tell people that it's really important to get to know the plants on your land, right? So you could use, if you want to go old school, if you will, you could get a book, with plant identification tips where you could go through and just ID the plant, the tree, the shrub, the perennial, whatever. Of course, these days people tend to use an app or a search engine, take a photo of the plant and then identify it. So it's a good idea to get to know the plants in your area and to know which of them are native plants and why that matters, and then which of them are not native. So just because a plant is not native to the area, which means it did not, originate here. This is not one of the places that that plant just naturally grows. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is an invasive plant. So what invasives are those plants that are brought from somewhere else. I have to say that 99% of the invasive plants that we work with are native to China and Japan, most of China. And so they are brought here to somewhere they don't belong. They don't have natural predators here to keep them in check. So what happens when they live in a temperate rainforest, as I mentioned earlier, is those plants tend to reproduce rapidly. And if they're invasive, it means they're creating a monoculture, or at least they're trying to. They're trying to be the only plant that lives there. So what happens is they end up out competing this wonderful diversity of native plants that we have, again, in one of the most biologically diverse places in the world. So they start to outcompete those plants. So just because it's non-native doesn't mean it's invasive, but if you get a good source for plant identification and perhaps even check a couple of sources, if the plant is invasive, then it is important to get that plant out as quickly as you see it. An important thing to note is that one of the ways that invasive plants can be spread is even in nursery stock. So we can buy a potted plant, bring it into our yard, put it in, and it could actually have seeds of invasive plants in the soil. It could be that wind blew it in, or it could be that it was in the soil that was used to pot that plant, or perhaps it was one that was grown in the ground at a nursery. And again, the wind is blowing, or a bird is eating the berry off of English ivy or Oriental bittersweet or Chinese privet, and then they sit, in that nursery stock, and then they basically poop out, the seed, and then it can grow an invasive plant. So
Okay.
monitoring is the most important thing to do.
I was going to ask you, so even before the monitoring, is there
Mhm.
anything I can do to prevent this from happening? So you can monitor it, but I'm just bought a home in Fairview, let's say. Is
Yeah.
there anything I should be aware of, or what do you do at that point in time?
So, unfortunately, the knowledge about invasive plants and their threats, and even about native plants and why they're important and which plants are native, is sorely lacking. So, if you don't know about invasive plants and native plants, it's really difficult to understand what can happen. And the fact that many of our neighbors, even areas along roadways, okay, public property, private property, when these plants are allowed to mature and go to seed, so they, just like people, right, when we mature and get to a point that we can have children, that's part of like why we exist, right, on the planet, is to keep our species going. It's the same thing with these invasive plants. So when they go to seed and they're going to seed on your neighbor's property or along a roadway, and the wind is blowing, or a bird is eating them, or another form of wildlife, they can also get moved on equipment. Let's say we bring in, excavation equipment or a lawnmower, right? Any kind of equipment can get the seeds or other plant material caught up in their wheels or their tracks or their buckets or whatever, and they can move those invasive plants onto our property. So there's really not anything that we can do to prevent that spread. The most important thing that we can do is understand the sources of invasive plants and monitor for them and react quickly.
Well, let me ask you then, in terms of contacting Raven, Invasive Plant Management, or some other organization, that if I'm a developer, for example, in the area, or an HOA, we mentioned the introduction,
Yeah.
is that at that point in time, do I then contact you, or do you wait till something happens, or when it happens, it's too late?
Well, it's not too late.
Okay.
It's not too late if you have acres covered with invasive plants that have been maturing for decades, because that is the case with many of our clients, right? In some cases, actually, in many cases, I'll be honest, these invasive plants are actually planted because they're still, unfortunately, sold by nurseries. And so you could buy a burning bush, plant it in your yard, and then when it matures and produces the berries that contain the seeds, it's going to be spread. Okay. So there's always something we can do. So contact us anytime, because part of my mission here is to not just run the business, but it's to save the trees, to save the native plants, to protect biodiversity. I'm going to say it again, in one of the most biologically diverse places in the world, to protect our water, to protect our soil. So I enjoy educating people about these things and being educated. I'll be honest. I learn often. I didn't know a fraction of what I know now when I started doing this work. So I didn't know the majority of the invasive plants that we deal with now. I didn't know all of the native plants, not that I know them all now. There are over, I think, 2,800 varieties of blooming, flowering plants in the Appalachian Mountains, and many of them flower in the shade. So there are many things that I did not know, but I was willing to take action. I knew enough to try to do something about it. I learned from my clients. I learned from people who come and listen to my talks. I learned from neighbors. I learned from friends. So the point is, I keep learning, and I enjoy sharing that knowledge with other people because I believe this place is worth saving. So I do work with HOAs. I work with nonprofits, with land trusts, with conservation organizations, and most of all, with private landowners. So when someone contacts us through our website or, calling us, If they're within, let's say, a 30 to 45-minute drive, I do that consultation for free. And part of it is because I enjoy sharing the knowledge. Even if we don't get the business, I know that when I share this information with people, if they care about nature, if they care about trees, then they're gonna take this information and likely share it and do something about it.
And talk about what I said in the introduction. It's just kind of a cool thing that you got started like 6 years ago, whenever you got started pulling English ivy. And so just even the concept, what does that entail? Do you go out and just pull everything you see, or how do you even do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So English ivy, I would say, is one of the easier plants that we deal with. And the reason is the way that plant lives and grows. It typically will start at the base of a tree. And that's because if someone didn't purposefully plant it as a ground cover, it's being spread by those mature plants that are all around. Like I said, when the bird eats the berry that contains the seeds, and then they poop it out, and then the seed germinates, they're typically sitting in a tree when that happens. So it's usually rooted at the base of a tree, and the vines then just go out from that main root. They'll go out in every direction, right? And they just run along the top of the ground. Okay. So they're running along the top of the ground. So with English ivy, what we do is we start like in the farthest areas, where, let's say it's in an area, it's going to stop somewhere, right? So we kind of start from that outer area, like pulling and using a hand tool if necessary. And we pull it or cut it all the way back to where the main root goes into the soil. And depending on the size of that vine, we can either just pull or use a tool to gently like kind of cut the root system out of the soil.
What do you do? What do you do with all the stuff you collect?
Great question. So when I initially started this business, I was taking the debris to the Buncombe County landfill. And, that's when I was literally driving around in a Subaru, pulling an old farm trailer behind it. Okay. So I would load the English ivy into my farm trailer and I would go to the Buncombe County landfill. And the first couple of times I was instructed because they could see green waste, right?
Right.
Right in my trailer. So they said, you need to go to the brush area, take this to area 1 or 2. I don't remember the numbers. So I took it there and I dumped it, along with all this other yard waste, tree waste, that sort of thing. And I remember it was probably the third time that I went to the landfill. I thought, what do they do with this waste, And I had already learned through actually stopping and asking one of the, let's call them sanitation workers, who were picking up debris on the side of the road. I had stopped and actually asked them. I said, hey, what do you do with this stuff? Because I actually saw a pile of English ivy. And although the city says that you're not supposed to put invasive plants, you're not supposed to put vines, by the side of the road, people do it anyway. So the sanitation worker said we're taking it to a stump dump. And I was like, ooh, okay, that's maybe not a good idea with invasive plants because they are easily able to replicate themselves. Some of the invasive plants can literally reproduce from a tiny little bit of the root system. So if we're taking that and we're just putting it in a big tub grinder and we're, sending out these big pieces, right? Then it is possible that those plants could reproduce themselves. So I asked the landfill, back to going to the landfill. So I asked the person, maybe the third time I went in, I said, hey, I'm just curious. What are you doing, with this waste that is going into the green, area? And they said, well, we bring in a tub grinder and we grind it into mulch and then we use it around the landfill. So I said, oh, that's not good. The plants I'm bringing in here are invasive plants. So from now on, when I come in, I'm going to take it and put it in with household garbage. So for a long time, that's what I did. I dumped it with the household garbage because I would see, at the end of the day and just before the landfill closed, because that's usually when I was bringing things in, that they were basically using a big bulldozer, to push all of the garbage as far up as they could. And then they end up covering it all. And then they end up like putting a newspaper slurry on top of it. and then they seed it, I believe, you know. So I knew that there was no way that these invasive plants were going to grow out of that. But my vision all along was to take these plants that had been living here, you know, taking moisture from the soil, taking nutrients from the soil, and to actually use them to build healthy soil. Because I don't know if you know this, but we actually have quite a deficit in terms of healthy living soil. And it's really important because plants require that. If we don't have the right microbiology in the soil, then the plants aren't healthy.
So
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 now,
how is
go
it
ahead.
used for the healthy soil? That's what you're leading up to.
Say that again,
I'm
please.
sorry. So how is it used then for the healthy soil?
Yeah, so what we're doing now, I have a couple of green waste shredders that are made in another country because to my knowledge, we don't really make anything like that in the United States, that material is so fine that it's not going to reproduce. So I bought these green waste shredders, and now my preference would be to shred the material up on the site where we're pulling it or digging it from, you know, depending on the size of the plant. And then we can shred it and basically just blow it back onto the soil where it will break down. So much like the leaves that fall from the trees and sticks that fall from the trees, that material will end up breaking down, feeding, you know, the plants from which they come, and actually creating healthy soil over time if the microbiology of the soil is there. So I'm working on, we do that currently. There are, however, plants that have allelopathic chemicals in them. And basically, what that means is the plant excretes chemicals that are much like poison. So, black walnut is an example that people often know of. You know, they're like, oh, well, black walnut, you know, things, a lot of things can't grow with black walnut. So, some of the invasive plants that we deal with have different allelopathic chemicals, but they excrete them into the soil and they keep other, you know, beneficial plants from growing, the seeds from germinating. So those are not the plants that we're shredding up, you know, and putting back onto the land. Poison ivy is another
I
example.
was
It's
going to
actually,
ask you that. Even for
it's a
you,
native.
right?
Yeah.
But
So
even
many
for
people,
you, with dealing
go ahead.
poison ivy, though, it can be dangerous for you,
Yes.
or
It can be dangerous for some people.
right?
So poison ivy is actually a native plant. I want to, you know,
Okay.
stress that. And I didn't mention previously that the reason that native plants are important is they were meant to be here, right? So they came up here naturally. And native plants are important because they typically provide food and habitat. Okay. So, food and habitat for our native species. It could be our native pollinators, you know, the different bees that are supposed to be here, you know, wasps or birds, you know, the birds that are supposed to be here, or the wildlife, you know, that are native to this area. So, they provide food and habitat. They also have deeper root systems, so they help, you know, mitigate all the rain that we get in a temperate rainforest. They interact with the soil in positive ways to build the microbiome of the soil. So back to my point, and I'm kind of forgetting where I was. I tend to go off on these
We were
little.
talking about poison ivy, and
That's
then
right. So poison ivy is a native plant, so it is meant to be here, and it is actually an important food source for wildlife, for birds. It produces berries, which have the seeds, and the birds are meant to eat poison ivy. And that's one of the ways that plant gets spread everywhere. You know, I mentioned this earlier. The birds are not meant to eat the berries of English ivy. They're actually mildly toxic to birds. They're not meant to eat the Oriental bittersweet. However, we have an American bittersweet that was and still is in some places an important food source for birds. Unfortunately, those two plants, Oriental bittersweet and American bittersweet, are in the same family, so they have hybridized now. So whereas we had this native plant that was not destructive to the environment, we now have this Oriental bittersweet that the vines will get this big, they'll girdle trees, the birds are eating the berries, and they're spreading it and spreading it and spreading it. So poison ivy is an important native plant, which should be left alone when you have acres and acres of woods that, you know, it's not bothering you. However, when people have a small piece of land, you know, they're highly allergic to poison ivy, or the kids are out there playing and they've got poison ivy all over the ground, then naturally, you know, that's a plant that we would want to deal with. So that is also one that we're not putting in our shredder, because those oils in the poison ivy plant exist for many, many years. And if we were to put it in the shredder, those oils would be going like this, right? It wouldn't be safe to the people operating the shredder. And we'd also just be putting those oils back onto the ground. So these plants we're removing, and I don't want to give away my entire business plan, but I have a plan for how we're going to handle those allelopathic or poisonous plants, and again, turn them into something beneficial to build the soil.
What's ironic, actually, that you're a guest tonight is that you were telling me off the air that we just passed a milestone, or not a milestone, but a big event in some of the work you do. That was a national event, or what was that event?
Yeah, so Invasive Species Awareness Week is an international event, and here in the United States, the North American Invasive Species Management Association, I realize that's a mouthful, North American Invasive Species Management Association, NASMA is the acronym. This is a professional organization of, as the name suggests, invasive species managers. I am a member of that organization, and they take the lead in the United States for educating people about invasive species, not just plants. We're talking about microorganisms. We're talking about things like the pythons and the Everglades. We're talking about carp from China that are wiping out, native fish populations, all sorts of other life that fall under the category of invasive species. My part of it is invasive plants. But they put forth the knowledge and information and try to raise awareness of the threats of invasives. And here in the city of Asheville, for the third year in a row, we submitted to the mayor's office a proclamation to recognize Invasive Species Awareness Week here in the city of Asheville. So last week on Tuesday, I stood in front of the mayor, city council, along with some other invasive plant warriors, and accepted the mayor's proclamation for Invasive Species Awareness Week. So again, what we want to do is just help raise awareness about the threats of these plants and other invasive species. For instance, the hemlock woolly adelgid. So where we live, oak trees are our most important tree species, followed by hemlocks. Super, super important. And the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an insect from Asia, is actually wiping out acres and acres and acres of hemlock trees. And we have a local organization called the Hemlock Restoration Initiative. You can find them at savethehemlocks.org. They're a fantastic group of people who are trying to raise awareness about the hemlock woolly adelgids, save hemlocks. They do hike and treats where you can go into some beautiful, wooded areas like DuPont Forest, treat the woolly adelgid. They also provide training and information to landowners about how they can treat the hemlock woolly adelgid themselves. So the point is, we have a lot of different invasive species, and this event, which just happened. It was February 24th through March 2nd. So I did a couple of classes, if you will, at local libraries. And we're just all doing as much as we can to raise awareness.
And one of the things I'd like to thank you for doing, not only raising awareness by being on the show, but also mention the fact that you are speaking, it seems, a lot of different places, in perfect timing in that I think you told me you have an upcoming presentation scheduled. Is it tomorrow or next?
Yeah. Yep, that's right. So a lot
that?
of the information, the information is on the website at ravennc, as in northcarolina.com. Tomorrow evening, I'm doing the second class for Bee City USA Asheville and the Asheville Botanical Gardens Certified Pollinator Advocate series. So you don't have to be seeking the certification actually to attend these classes. You can just go to Asheville Botanical Gardens website or to Bee City USA Asheville's website, and you can follow a link to register for my class, as well as the other series of classes that are offered. This one will take place at the Asheville Botanical Garden from 6:30 until 7:30 or 8, and there's I do a presentation, and then there's time for questions at the end. They asked me to do the first session, I guess, a couple of weeks ago, and the demand was so great for it that they asked me to come back and do a second. Um, the next event that I have going on is also in conjunction with B City USA Asheville and the Rotary Club of Asheville. And they are bringing a speaker who is internationally known in the nature, supporting nature space, if you will. And he is University of Delaware professor Doug Tallamy. And he's an author, very prolific author. They have him as the keynote speaker on their Habitscaping environmental conference. And that's going to be held at AB Tech on May 17th. It runs for most of the day, and Doug Tallamy, as I mentioned, will be the keynote speaker, but they also have other presentations like mine, other organizations in the area, people who are passionate about nature and native plants, who will be speaking on that agenda.
And so you'll be speaking at
I
that
will.
event
Yep.
too? And so
Yep.
when folks want information on that event, the whole event, they can also go to your website?
They can go to my website and get a link to basically B City USA Asheville's website where you can register for that event. And then I also want to mention the Cullowhee Native Plant Conference, which if you've lived in this area for some time and you know or care about native plants, you have probably heard of the Cullowhee Native Plant Conference. It's held at Western Carolina University in Silva, and in Cullowhee, which is close to Silva. And it is a fantastic, fantastic conference. I mean, I feel like it's been around for 20 years. Some of the best names in native plants and, supporting nature in the area are behind that conference. Adam Bigelow is one of my personal favorites. He leads Bigelow's Botanical Excursions. I encourage you to search that up. And if you can get into one of his nature walks where he shares his amazing and broad knowledge of native plants. Adam is one of the organizers for that event. So I was asked this year to speak at that event as well.
And when is that going?
I'm also,
When is that going to be?
that is happening in July. I believe the dates are like the 15th, 16th, 17th. It's a multi-day event. But if you just put, again, you can go to my website. You can put Cullowhee Native Plant Conference in a search. All of that information is actually on Western Carolina University's website. That's where it's housed. But you can register. I believe the registration is open. Someone told me it's open now, but I believe they really start announcing it like in April. Maybe they don't have the whole agenda, pinned down right now, but multi-day event. Search it up. It's fantastic. They have native plant vendors. They have a big bookseller. It is really a great conference.
Again, I'm suggesting to make it easy for folks, almost like a one-stop shopping thing. Is that we want to get information on anything you've talked about tonight or these upcoming conferences, just go to your website, Raven. I'll ask you one more time to repeat it.
Yeah, it's ravennc.com. And I want to mention one other event that is, sort of in our area.
Okay.
I'm also speaking at a couple of events in South Carolina. South Carolina Native Plant Society is a wonderful organization. I'm speaking at their meeting in June. I'm also speaking to the Greenville area gardening clubs. But in September, I believe the date is September 30th, Cashiers and Highlands Land Trust, in conjunction with the Village, I think it's just called the Village Center in Cashiers. They do a nature series over the summer, and it's one day a month. I was invited to speak, and I'm doing that on September 30th. So it's at the Village Green. That's what it's called, the Village Green in Cashiers, and seems like a fantastic series of events where people can learn about different aspects of nature. So again, all that information is available on my website.
The only thing I think missing is, I should have asked you earlier, I don't see your roller skates in the back, in terms of getting around to all these different sessions, but seems you're going to have a busy spring and summer.
Yeah, I do. Again, I'm really passionate about educating people, and when people come and hear me talk, they're very engaged. I'm fortunate enough to have had experiences in my previous work life where I got to speak in front of people. So I'm very comfortable doing that. The feedback is always that I'm an engaging speaker. I also bring some of my invasive plant specimens. I'm talking like giant vines, big root balls that we have taken out from, various job sites. And I spread those around the room. I like to share a lot of information about native plants, why they're important, why invasive plants are a threat, how we deal, with these invasive plants. And the feedback is always fantastic.
And I can obviously see your enthusiasm is contagious. So thank
Yes.
you very much for being my guest on this edition of Blaine's World website. I'd also like to thank my producer, Cappy Tassetti. And hopefully one of these days I'll actually bump into you in Fairview, North Carolina.
I
Thank you.
hope so. And just to mention, we both write for the Fairview Town Crier. Unfortunately, I don't have the time with all of my roller skating around to write every month. But when I have time, I submit articles to them that are published as well.
Great. Thanks, Raven. Good speaking to you.
Thank you so much.